Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you, Minister. I suppose it's never an easy task as an opposition independent to be able to get legislation all the way through the Houses, and I think you know, even though it's not fully realised in terms of its implementation yet, I think it's extremely significant, I suppose, of what can be done within the Seanad when working with departments, when we find common ground and things that we need to change. And I want to thank, I suppose, you for that. From the very offset, when this issue was raised, you and your officials began to engage very quickly, like you said, carrying out your own research, which thankfully backed up what I was saying. And obviously, non-disclosure agreements by their very nature are secret. So carrying out research to actually understand NDAs is a really, really difficult task. So I would like to congratulate your office and your officials for managing, I suppose, to be able to take that research as far as we possibly could given the climate of secrecy. What I'm also really, I suppose, happy about is that in talking to you and hearing your contribution today is that my bill actually doesn't go far enough in some extent, in some situations, in terms of actually incorporating the idea of NDAs preempting stuff, like so being in contracts and stuff. And you know, it would be great, I suppose, as we move forward to be able to continue to tease out some of those things to make sure that the full extent of NDAs is captured within the government legislation, your own department's legislation in this regard. I would like to also acknowledge the work of Professor Julie McFarlane. She was a law professor in UCC here once upon a time, and she's in Canada now, and she heads up a law school there. She wasn't subject to an NDA, but she became embroiled in an NDA because as an employer she was expected to give a reference for somebody that she knew was actually being moved around because of sexual harassment. And through her own breaking of that and refusing to be complicit in that, her own work really began in this area from a legal perspective. And she and Seb McAteer, who was in my office at the time, were key in drafting that legislation as it currently stands, which is actually getting international recognition, as you said, for being the strongest legislation to date in this area, because there is a number of states in the United States who are bringing forward legislation, Canadian provinces, Australian provinces. The UK recently passed an amendment to a piece of legislation that directly looks at universities. Thankfully, obviously, ours is much wider than that and covers all employment law, regardless of the sector, because it is very cross-cut and it goes into every sector, because it's not only a sectoral issue, it's actually becoming a standard practice in the heads of legal professions who are just automatically writing this stuff into contracts, into severance agreements, into non-disparagement agreements, and just presenting it as this is just the done thing to do. So regardless of what sectors they show up in, it actually really needs a massive culture change within the legal profession itself. And I think that this conversation has gone a huge way to being able to raise the awareness of their impact on many individuals in terms of the people who have signed them here in Ireland. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Robert in my office, who has obviously been with me for the last 2 years to take it to the point we're at now. We had a very successful event last night where we flew Zelda Perkins over to have a conversation, who was the woman that broke the Harvey Weinstein NDA, but then her work exploded, I suppose, the whole area of how often, obviously that's a very extreme case, but it's not always as extreme as that. And I think the work of Zelda Perkins and Professor Julie McFarlane has been to kind of highlight the systemic use of NDAs for a whole spectrum of issues and severity. So again, I'd like to thank my own office and Brian O'Flynn as well for helping me to continue to, I suppose, to have a bit of energy behind this, because, you know, when work takes a few years and other stuff drags you in different directions, you need to make sure you have people to be able to continue to work behind the scenes. So I'm very grateful for that. What I want to finish on is just a few quotes. Obviously, because of the secret nature of NDA, a lot of the testimony I have is all anonymous. So I just wanted to finish on reminding us, this room, why NDAs are so important, and give those people some element of a voice in this piece of legislation today. So they're just quotes directly from people who've been impacted in Ireland by NDAs. Coming forward should not be as painful and should not carry as much risk for someone as it currently does. It is unacceptable that workers would be forced to stay silent after being subject to this atrocious behaviour, especially when mandatory silence only serves to perpetuate the culture of secrecy that allows abusers to continue tormenting and abusing other workers. NDAs are ubiquitous, particularly in the US and in places where US companies operate. Though they are not a uniquely American thing, the Catholic Church and many other institutions have used NDAs for years. It puts you in a position where you cannot be honest in your personal relationships and you cannot be honest in your professional relationships. It's an extremely lonely, isolating place to be. Who can you talk to about what happened to you? Nobody, they said. Well, liars. Not your spouse or your family? No. Would a therapist fall under this? I'm not even sure. NDAs can make it harder for us to learn about and therefore prevent actual harassment. That's going to physically harm individuals, psychologically harm individuals. There's a psychological harm that results from agreeing to not tell your story, the story of your own life. And that psychological harm is not one that you would appreciate, probably when you first signed that contract. I would say that for women signing settlements and then signing an NDA, not only are they signing to be quiet, which is what the general public thinks in the majority of the cases, you are signing to never work in your chosen profession ever again. She said dealing with the fallout of her time at the company had been as painful as grappling with the death of her mother years before. Being unable to discuss it with anyone made it uniquely difficult. I am voiceless. I am terrified of the NDA that keeps me silent. The only winners were the barristers, solicitors and managers who covered up. I was paid for my notice period, but that was less than the legal fees I incurred. I feel that I have lost my rights as a citizen. I cannot report their white-collar crimes. I cannot resort to the adjudication. I cannot have justice for the discrimination that I endured because their access to limitless funds allowed them to purchase injustice. So just to finish by saying, as you can see, when we have enforced silence, behind that silence there'll always be a roar. And I think the moment we begin to remove tools that are used to legally allow people to be silenced against their will or coerced into their silence, that ultimately people will start speaking and people will start pushing back. And I hope that this legislation and this work goes a far way to be able to give those people back their voice. Thank you.